All right, let's dive right into this comprehensive clinical explainer on the psychodynamics of trauma. Today, we're not just skimming the surface of what trauma is, we're essentially going to break down the specific intrapsychic mechanisms at play. We're going to look at exactly what happens to the human mind when an overwhelming experience literally cannot be mentalized.
Here's our roadmap for this session. We'll be navigating this systematically, going from mechanism all the way to clinical manifestation. We'll cover trauma and integration failure, attachment trauma, avoiding internal experience, the three non-mentalizing nodes, dissociation and self-fragmentation, and finally wrap up with clinical implications.
So, let's kick things off with Section 1, Trauma and Integration Failure.
Clinically speaking, we really have to define trauma as way more than just a bad event. It is fundamentally an overwhelming experience. It's an experience that completely shatters the mind's ability to integrate affect, memory, and sense of self. When the mind faces something that entirely destroys its capacity to adapt, it leads directly to severe affect dysregulation. It's not just a memory issue, we're talking about a massive failure of psychological integration.
Now look at this mandatory causal chain, because you'll see this in your patients all the time. The trauma generates an overwhelming affect. Because this affect is just too much, there's an absolute inability to represent the experience in the mind. The mind just can't do it. This triggers defenses like dissociation, avoidance, or behavioral enactment. And that defensive move guarantees a failure to process the memory, which is exactly why the symptoms persist. It's a vicious cycle.
Okay, moving on to Section 2. Let's look at attachment trauma and internal objects, and how this starts in early development.
Developmentally, when we talk about attachment trauma, we're usually looking at disorganized attachment. Think about it. What happens when a child's primary caregiver is simultaneously the source of pure terror and their only source of safety? To survive this impossible paradox, the child basically internalizes or uses introjective identification to take in the abusive caregiver. It's a survival mechanism to maintain some illusion of control when they're otherwise completely desperate.
But that introjection, it comes with absolutely crushing internal object consequences. Clinically, you'll see this manifest as profound shame, utter helplessness, and a total loss of personal agency. But the really crucial one to understand here is guilt. Traumatized kids will often blame themselves, using guilt as a desperate, heartbreaking attempt to rationalize the abuse. Because in their mind, if they are bad, then the parent can still be good, and their world still makes some kind of sense, no matter how terrifying it is.
Next up, Section 3, Avoiding Internal Experience. To cope with all those unbearable internal consequences we just talked about, the traumatized mind resorts to deep-seated avoidance. But the crucial distinction here is situational versus experiential avoidance. Situational avoidance is dodging external triggers, like staying away from a certain location. Experiential avoidance, on the other hand, is the flight from one's own mind in internal states. They might use substances, self-harm, or severe emotional numbing just to escape their own internal pain. And it's exactly this experiential avoidance that fatally prevents psychological integration and locks those trauma symptoms firmly in place.
Now, Section 4. Let's talk about what happens when mentalization completely fails. The three non-mentalizing modes.
When the capacity to mentalize collapses under pressure, the patient's mind regresses into three specific modes. First, psychic equivalence, where internal fears are experienced as absolute external reality. This is exactly what happens during a flashback. Second is pretend mode, where feelings are totally detached from reality, leading to dissociative detachment and derealization. And third is the teleological mode, where psychological pain can't be symbolized, so it's expressed purely through concrete physical actions, like behavioral enactment or self-harm.
To give you a quick clinical vignette, a patient stuck in psychic equivalence literally cannot say, "It feels as if you're angry with me." That requires a level of mentalization they just don't have access to in that moment. Instead, they have a paranoid certainty that you actually are sadistic. They completely collapse the past and the present into one terrifying reality right there in your office.
Building on those non-mentalizing modes, let's jump into Section 5, Dissociation and Self-Fragmentation.
Let's define this clearly. Dissociation is, at its core, the mind's ultimate emergency survival strategy. It's a defense mechanism that disrupts the continuity of identity, memory, consciousness, and perception. Why? To retain an illusion of control in the face of absolute helplessness. It physically and psychologically compartmentalizes an inescapable threat.
Clinically, this defense operates on a spectrum. On the milder end, you have depersonalization and derealization, feeling like you aren't real or the world around you isn't real. As you move further down the spectrum, you hit severe dissociative amnesia, where traumatic memories are completely walled off. And finally, you reach the extreme end, the total fragmentation of self-experience, where the very sense of self is completely shattered.
And that all brings us to this core relationship formula. It perfectly ties everything together. Early trauma plus disorganized attachment plus the failure to mentalize equals dissociation as a necessary psychological sequestering. When a threat absolutely cannot be processed, dissociation becomes a psychological mandate to isolate that memory just to survive.
Finally, let's move to Section 6, Clinical Implications and Recovery.
We absolutely have to differentiate how our patients present if we want to be effective. A classic PTSD presentation is marked by hyperarousal and emotional undermodulation. The patient is basically flooded with emotion. But the dissociative subtype? That presents with extreme emotional overmodulation. These patients show profound numbing and detachment. They aren't flooded, they are completely numb.
Neurobiologically, we're looking at something fascinating here. In classic PTSD, the prefrontal cortex fails to inhibit the limbic system. But in dissociative presentations, we actually see excessive midline prefrontal inhibition of those limbic regions. So mechanically, this perfectly explains the clinical numbing we see in highly dissociative patients.
Because of this, the clinical implications are crystal clear. Standard exposure therapies can actually be quite dangerous for highly dissociative patients if used improperly. We absolutely must use phased-based interventions. You have to prioritize restoring mentalization, modifying those attachment schemas, and rebuilding the patient's lost sense of agency before you ever attempt to process the traumatic memories.
I love this quote from Bromberg. He says we aren't treating patients to cure them of something done in the past. Rather, we're trying to cure them of what they still do to themselves and others to cope with what was done. We are essentially treating coping mechanisms that have outlived their usefulness. So, as clinicians, we ultimately have to ask ourselves, how can our therapeutic stance, our very presence in the room, provide the safe, mentalizing environment that this traumatized mind desperately needs to finally integrate its shattered experience? Thanks for joining me on this deep clinical dive.